Alright folks, today I'm here to take you through the 8th volume of the Walking Dead comics, Made to Suffer, which is the final and, in my opinion, best volume of Compendium 1. If you haven't seen my videos covering the previous volumes up to this point, I'd highly recommend checking those out beforehand, as I will not be reintroducing the characters or plotlines we first encountered in those installments, which will lead to some confusion as the comic differs quite a bit from the show. But I will give a small recap of the last volume before we get started to get you on track. This chapter could easily be seen as the deadliest in the entire series, as the Governor arc reaches its climax with the Madman unleashing his revenge onto the prison. When people say they prefer the early installments of the comics, this volume is typically why. This version of the story is a lot bloodier than the TV version, so I'm excited to hear what you guys think about it in the comments down below. And with that, if you end up enjoying this video, please consider hitting that like button to let me know you want to see this series continue. While awaiting retaliation from Woodbury for over 2 months, our survivors had been lured into a false sense of security as they had seen little signs of them since the death of Martinez. Their crops were thriving, Glenn and Maggie had tied the knot, Dale survived a bite despite losing a foot, and Lori's baby Judith arrived on time and healthy. For the first time since taking the prison, morale was high for all. That is, except for Carol, who is still greatly struggling with her mental health from previous events. So after venting her frustrations to a walker chained inside the fence for research, she feeds herself to it as all she wished to do was die in a sick reminder of the horrors of this world, leaving her daughter Sophia behind as an orphan. This was a tragedy that left some angry, but most in shock. However, their time grieving would be cut short as, in the distance, the sound of accelerating vehicles catch our survivors' attention as the governor himself arrives riding on a tank, demanding his army kill them all. As our story takes a step back to the immediate aftermath of that fateful encounter between Michonne and the governor, we retread the events that led to their attack on the prison as the Madman lies mutilated, but alive to the shock of the Woodbury goons who demand a drunk ex-army medic named Bob Stuckey save his life, which he does as the governor awakens in the infirmary a week later. Although Bob claims it wasn't exactly difficult as she had sealed many of the wounds with the blowtorch, almost as if she wanted to leave him alive only to take more later. Dr. Stevens and Alice leaving weren't a part of the plan, but it was worth it for the information Martinez was returning with. Or so he thought, as later that day his body would be found, leaving him with no choice but to address the people, which comes in the form of straight lies as he claims those at the prison were terrorists who snuck into Woodbury, robbed them, mutilated him, kidnapped their doctors, and killed their men, while all he wanted to do was help them and combine their camps, before proving their savagery by presenting Martinez's turned head for all to see, which rallies his people behind his cause to expunge these terrorists from their area. Although his ongoing and escalating descent into madness wouldn't end here, as after returning to his apartment, the governor forcefully removes Penny's teeth and kisses her reanimated corpse on the mouth before throwing up. I don't even have an explanation for what the f this was about. Dude's just completely lost it at this point. But interrupting his moment, I guess, one of the Woodbury goons alert him to the explosion at the National Guard's outpost and Walmart shootout we saw last chapter, where he angrily demands they follow the tire tracks left behind, only to discover the prison just sitting there in a field, as they witness Andrea and company dragging the roamer inside the fence, which they say is crazy, but I guess they forgot about their little fight club. Regardless, despite locating their base, the governor demands they wait so the others let their guard down, which we know turned out to be an effective tactic. So biding their time before arming up with all their weaponry from the National Guard's outpost, The madman asks Penny to be good for Uncle Bob as their army loads up and sets out to end this once and for all. The governor we first met back in Volume 5 was already a sadistic psychopath with no issues killing innocents. But how did he get to this point? Who was he before, and why is he the way he is now? Well, as many of you know, there is a series of novels that retread the governor's story from the beginning. And although there is a ton of content in these books, I'm gonna try to keep it short and just highlight the key events to his backstory for the sake of time. So if you're interested in experiencing the novels in their entirety, I'd recommend picking them up for yourself. Or, just wait until I cover them in a separate video one day. We learn his name is Brian Blake, who was nothing like the man we met in Volume 5, and found himself taking shelter in Wiltshire Estates on his way to Atlanta along with his brother Philip, niece Penny, and other survivors during the initial outbreak. But when it was overrun, like how we saw back in Volume 2, Brian had left a warning sign for future survivors as the group was forced to make their way to the big city, where they of course discover it completely wasted. In this time, the group is led to a safe house by a woman named April where they take shelter for a few days. But here, we begin to see the depravity of Philip as he assaults April before getting threatened at gunpoint to leave. That's right, Philip, the governor's brother. Not Brian himself, as Brian was generally considered to be a good-natured but weak man who always relied on Philip for protection in their childhood, which may sound insane when looking at the disturbed leader we know. But these hostile personality traits within Philip would only become ever the more prevalent, as an encounter with a gang of raiders leaves Penny dying from a gunshot wound in he and Brian's arms, which breaks Philip and causes him to beat Brian before torturing the gang members for days on end until unrecognizable. Following this event, Philip's dark side would take full control as the reanimated Penny had been tied to a tree while the group came across the town of Woodbury, a well-fortified settlement that had a problem with the neighboring National Guard outpost, who was regularly bullying the citizens into obeying their commands. Philip had snuck Penny into town and was feeding her the limbs of captured and mutilated survivors he killed himself. But after getting caught tying a girl up in the woods, another group member would shoot him in spite of Brian's pleas, leaving the now grieving brother to see red and kill the armed man without thinking twice. But as Philip passed away in his arms, Brian was left with nobody as he always relied on his brother for everything. So when a town meeting leaves the civilians wondering what to do about the National Guard, Brian has an out-of-body experience where he channels his brother's rage, and after encouraging the people of Woodbury to fight back and kill the National Guardsmen, the soon-to-be governor introduces himself to Martinez as Philip Blake. Now, the story of the novels don't end here, but for the most part, this is our highly summarized backstory to the madman. Brian was weak and unfit to survive in this world, so following the death of his disturbed brother, he assumed his identity, adopted his sadistic tendencies, and essentially became him in order to survive this nightmare, which led him to rise up as the leader or governor that would defeat the National Guard, but oppress his people even harder. Philip may have bled out that night, but it was Brian who died and never came back, as today the disturbed man fires onto the prison housing the elderly and children as our survivors scramble to take cover. Although in a tactic that shows just how sick he truly is, the governor calls a ceasefire and demands they give themselves up in exchange for mercy, which we all know is bullshit and would only lead to execution for our survivors, but gives Andrea a free moment to get into position and fire onto Brian and his band of soldiers. However, surviving thanks to the body armor, the governor exposes her position and commands his men to pepper the watchtower with bullets, which seemingly pierces her through the head, giving the forces of Woodbury the chance to use their vehicles to clear the fence of roamers, before resuming firing at the pinned survivors as Axel takes a bullet to the arm. Despite having the means to fight back, Neither Glenn, who made his way up to a neighboring tower, or the survivors below could land a hit in the chaos. That is, except for Andrea, who not only survived the bullets grazing, but lies waste to the unsuspecting Woodbury soldiers below, forcing their army to retreat for the time being as our survivors regroup with their injured. Although they backed off for now, they were almost guaranteed to return and hit even harder. So at this time, they were gonna have to patch up their wounded and prepare for battle, which was gonna prove more difficult than expected as Rick, their leader, steps out from inside the prison and collapses to the ground with a gunshot wound not far off from the one that plunged him into this nightmare to begin with. Andrea and Axel will be fine, but for now, Rick remains unconscious at possibly the worst time imaginable. Thankfully, Patricia would finally come into use for the first time in the series by offering her O-negative blood to help him recover, but that still leaves the question of what the hell to do now. Some, such as Dale and Andrea, are considering just packing everything up and leaving without looking back. But others, like Michonne and Tyrese, are debating using this calm before the storm to sneak in and assassinate the madman before this is taken any further. So heading out on foot, the two set off to fulfill what Michonne failed to do all those issues ago, as Dale pleads for Lori to save the lives of her children by fleeing with them, which she angrily declines, but Glenn and Maggie accept, wanting to start a family of their own as they load up and take off in the RV while leaving the others, with Herschel fearing this may be the last time he sees his daughter. But right now, it was time to get defenses into position, as Lori tells Carl stories of Rick's childhood defending his brother Jeffrey from fights he couldn't win, showing us Rick was always dedicated to protecting the ones he loved in the face of insurmountable odds. He wouldn't let his family get hurt no matter what it took, and right now, it took waking up and getting back on his feet, which he does within only hours of his injury. But unfortunately, there wasn't really much even he could do, as over half their fighters had fled. As for Michonne and Tyrese, they had barely traveled any distance before already encountering Woodbury soldiers in the forest who they engage in battle. But without seeing the outcome of the fight, we pick back up with the same men arriving to the governor with Tyrese unconscious and Michonne's sword in possession, as Gabe claims to have shot and killed her in the woods. However, there was no time for our survivors back at the prison to worry about them right now, as they had children to defend. Rick believed with enough precautions they could stand a chance against their army, but just in case they couldn't, their armored truck had been loaded up with supplies for escape, while Carl is given his gun back for protection, symbolizing the dark times they thought were behind them returning. There's a grim feeling among all who remain in the prison as some turn to God, while others do the exact opposite in this trying time. But through this darkness, there was light, as Judith shines as a beacon of hope for our survivors. Hope that was crushed within seconds as a single truck approaches the prison's gate, revealing the governor wielding Michonne's sword along with a bound Tyrese, where he demands their surrender or his death. But as mentioned, there wasn't going to be any mercy from this madman, and they all knew it. So coming to terms with what was about to happen, as they shouldn't have left in the first place, Rick and company watch as Brian decapitates Tyrese in front of them. And although Billy would attempt to take them out while they drove away, he was no Andrea, as he misses every shot, leaving the survivors behind in a state of hopelessness. In spite of this killing morale across the prison, the governor still saw this as a loss, as they didn't surrender, declaring it was time to end this for good, just as the not-so-dead Michonne appears behind him with a gun to his head, as if not caring for her own life, but only grazes him as Gabe gets a shot off on her while she slips back into the trees with her sword. This was the final straw. There were no more false mercies coming. It was time to stand ground and take them all out. So while barely getting a chance to grieve Tyrese and presumably Michonne's deaths, the forces of Woodbury arrive at full speed before laying waste to the roamers around the fence and firing onto our survivors once again, this time immediately killing Axel in the attack. Rick and the others would do their best to lie down defensive fire, but it was a grenade thrown by Billy that really shook up the battlefield. And as the Governor Demandscape regained control of the situation, the goon receives a bullet to the head as Andrea standing on top the RV had returned along with the others as backup. Just as a Woodbury soldier slams a truck into its side, leaving the RV a wreck and Andrea heavily injured. This was no longer about taking the prison in the governor's eyes. It was solely about extermination as Brian hops in the tank and demands the driver demolish their way through the fence, effectively already leaving this place useless as the soldiers and the dead alike flood in. For our survivors, defense was no longer an option. It was time to get out of there now. So sprinting through the prison corridors to retrieve his family, Rick discovers Alice holding Lori at gunpoint. But to his relief, this was an act set up to fool the forces of Woodbury into believing she was still on their side. They didn't know what to do as they were terrified, but right now they had to go. Unfortunately, most of our survivors wouldn't be a match for the now pushing army, as Patricia takes a bullet to the head right in front of Billy, who immediately takes a bullet to the head in his father's arms while attempting to escape. The soldier responsible had shown clear regret from his actions, but that wouldn't stop the governor from demanding they open fire onto Rick and his family as they attempt to flee, with Alice taking a shot to the leg while laying down cover fire, before another to the head as delivered by the governor himself. Although the atrocities committed wouldn't end here, as Brian commands a woman named Lily Call, who had recently suffered a miscarriage, to take aim and shoot Lori through the back, leaving her to collapse and crush Judith in one of The Walking Dead's most horrific and shocking moments, forcing Rick to painstakingly abandon them in the middle of the courtyard as he escorts his son through the roamer-riddled hole in the fence. With only Herschel remaining, he begs the governor for death as he has now lost 6 of his 7 children, which he swiftly grants without thinking twice. The horrors Lily was forced to commit had left her broken in tears. This was her final straw, as The Road to Woodbury and Fall of the Governor novels further show us the pain she went through under his rule and manipulation. So as the roamers begin surrounding the remaining army, the governor yells at his soldiers to stick together, before suffering a gunshot to the back of the head by Lily as she throws his limp corpse to the biters, finally ending his, or in a sense, his brother's tyrannical reign for good. With the fences down and the dead flooding in, Rick and Carl walk upon a hill as the failed leader tells his son not to look back. But without his mother and baby Judith right behind, Carl could only break down in tears and hug his father as the prison falls in the distance. Alright folks, and that was The Walking Dead Volume 8 Made to Suffer, one of the most exciting installments in the series yet. We lost many faces throughout this chapter, and although some weren't the most beloved characters out there, others will be sorely missed, such as Tyrese, who was one of the best characters in these early issues and fits his role as Rick's right-hand man well. I adore the fast-paced action of this volume, and at times struggled to pick a favorite between the 2 versions of the battle. They're so different from each other, so it is hard to compare, but if I had to, I think I'd still say I prefer the show version. Too Far Gone is a masterpiece of an episode, and although Herschel is the only one of our survivors to die in the adaptation during this event, his death was worth 9 Patricias at least. However, I'd have to admit I find the governor's death to be unsatisfying compared to the show. If you didn't read the novels, which came out years after the fact, you wouldn't even know who Lily was, so I feel it makes much more sense for Michonne to get the kill. One thing I always found really interesting was the survival of Woodbury in the comics. Following the massacre, Lily takes over the town and becomes its leader, which is covered in the succeeding novels. It's a huge departure from the show, but I think it serves well for world building. Although that's just my opinion, and I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Volume 9 begins one of my favorite eras of the comics, so definitely look out for that video in the coming weeks. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching.